Well, welcome to Trauma Sensitive Strategies, the Boys Town Approach. My name is Susan Lamke. I'm the Director of National Training. I've been with Boys Town since 1990 and a variety of capacities. For the last 20 plus years, I've been in our National Training Department in various capacities. And this position has offered me the opportunities to train and consult to schools across the country who are implementing our Boys Town education model. So we always want to make sure that we are staying current with the current research and trends in education and childcare. So about 5 years ago, we started to explore the world of trauma. And so we wanted to also explore that world of trauma and see how and where the Boys Town education model aligns so that we're providing the best services that we can for kids. So we started working with the Child Welfare Providers Training Academy, and I started the training of facilitators process. So I'm partially through that, but we are working on our alignment. And so we'd like to share that with you today. Here at Boys Town, our focus is on changing the way America cares for children and families. For nearly 100 years, Boys Town has worked to strengthen communities as we support children and families seeking healing. This healing might be related to past trauma, relational challenges, or even mental health concerns. Boys Town provides a range of services to meet children and families where they are at and to serve them in the greatest capacity possible. Boys Town also works hard to empower schools to effectively deal with the ever-increasing challenges that present themselves each and every day. Our research-driven and supported education model provides schools and programs with a safe, positive, proactive approach to teaching pro-social behaviors. It provides multi-tiered support for students with variable needs while increasing consistency and effectiveness of staff. So let's take a look at our goals for our brief time together today. Today we will briefly explore trauma, where it originates, and how it impacts one's response system. We will also look at how you can begin to build a foundation and incorporate core principles that contribute to trauma-sensitive schools and how the Boys Town education model aligns with these practices. You know, I'm sure many of you are fitting this webinar into a very busy day. So we all experience some level of stress on a regular basis, whether at work and trying to fit in these things in our busy day, or meeting deadlines, traffic, juggling, family needs. All of these things are very common for us. We also face more intense experiences like caring for an aging parent, ongoing stress at work, financial pressures, or even dealing with a major loss. Even positive experiences can be stressful, like getting married, moving, or starting a new job. In many cases, we roll with the punches in these stressful events because we have the capacity to cope with a range of life experiences, whether they're expected or unexpected, mild or intense. So a lot of people ask, are stress and trauma one and the same? And no, they're not. Trauma is different. Trauma is an event a person experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with that involved actual, perceived, or threatened death. Trauma overwhelms one's ability to cope, and it has lasting adverse effects on a person's mental, physical, social, emotional well-being. So it's very much different than stress. Traumatic events that some of your students might face at school or in their communities come in many forms. They range from one-time incidents such as an accident, a natural disaster, the loss of a parent or peer. It could be a single experience of violence such as a robbery, or experiences that are chronic or even generational, such as ongoing abuse, neglect, chronic bullying, exposure to family or community violence. Immediate reactions to traumatic events include feelings of fear, helplessness, and loss of control. Traumatic experiences may have short and long-term effects on the health and well-being of students. Trauma can also alter how kids view themselves, others, and the world around them. Trauma can challenge their belief that the world is a safe place, that other people can be trusted, and that they're worthy of care and protection. And students feeling the effects of trauma oftentimes communicate this through their behavior at school. The one thing that's really important to remember about trauma is only the person who suffered or experienced the event can actually determine if it's trauma for them. Whether or not an event or circumstance is traumatic depends on their experience of that event. We cannot say that a particular situation, say witnessing violence, for example, is always traumatic for everyone, Whether an event is experienced as traumatic is influenced by many factors, including one's own internal coping strategies, the child's external supports, their age, gender, and the relationship involved with the others. Trauma comes in many forms, shapes, and sizes, but let's just explore two types really quick. Acute trauma is experiencing serious threats of actual serious injury to self or witnessing others being injured. It's a violation of personal physical integrity. Some examples of acute trauma include school shootings, gang violence, natural disasters, physical or sexual assault. Complex trauma, on the other hand, describes both exposure to multiple traumatic events from an early age and the immediate and long-term effects of these experiences over the course of development. Examples of complex trauma include chronic abuse, neglect, or exposure to family violence. Many of the students sitting in your classrooms may be suffering from complex trauma. And complex trauma is particularly devastating because it often occurs during critical periods of brain development, before a child has had the chance to develop strong positive ways to cope with stress. Children with complex trauma are likely to exhibit a range of behavioral and academic difficulties that require additional intervention by adults. So who is impacted by trauma? How common is trauma? It's actually more common than you think. The rates of childhood trauma in the United States are alarmingly high. Exposure to potentially traumatic forms of violence, such as abuse, assault, or family or community, are very common. Currently in the U.S., 2 out of 3 children have been exposed to violence in the past year. Out of these children, 50% report more than one form of victimization. 1 in 6 report 6 or more exposures to violence, with physical assault, witnessing violence, and maltreatment being the most common forms. Unfortunately, these numbers are actually higher for children of color. According to the Adverse Child Experiences, or ACE study, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, adults also report high rates of childhood adversity. Almost 2/3 of the adults surveyed in the study reported at least one adverse childhood experience, with the majority of people surveyed having 2 or more. Adverse childhood experiences that adults were asked about in the study included physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, emotional and physical neglect, household substance abuse, household mental illness, a mother or a mother figure who was treated violently, a separation or divorce, or any incarceration of a family member. The ACE study found that as rates of adverse child experiences go up for a person, so does the risk of their high-risk behavior, illness, and even early death. And you'll see this as kids develop. Before we talk about how we can address the trauma and how it aligns with the model, it's important to understand the impact of trauma. We must first consider how a child's brain and body respond to a traumatic event. The brain has a built-in alarm system that is designed to detect a potential threat and help the body respond quickly and effectively to keep us safe. What's commonly known as that flight or fight. We are going to very briefly, look at 3 main parts of the brain and the role that each plays in the stress response. Keep in mind as we go through, the brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. The brain starts forming with the brain stem, which is located at the bottom of the brain. This controls all the major systems needed to keep us alive, including our heart rate and our breathing. The brainstem prepares the body to react in a threatening situation, so it keeps us safe. The next part of the brain to form is the limbic system, and this is known as the emotional control center of the brain. This part of the brain determines how we feel about an experience, whether it's pleasurable or whether it's frightening. It looks out for danger, and it reacts accordingly. With the limbic system, there are 2 areas that play a key role in the stress response. A structure called the amygdala acts like a smoke detector to identify a potential threat and sound the alarm. The hypothalamus hears that alarm and communicates that message to the rest of the body so that it's prepared to respond. Together, we can think of the limbic system and the brain system as that emotional brain. It operates on those feelings. The last part is the neocortex, and it is known as the thinking brain. This part of the brain is responsible for reasoning, planning, problem solving, making meaning of experiences, and regulating emotions and behaviors. When faced with a threat, the thinking brain helps us to decide if we're actually in danger, and if so, how to respond, or it helps us to return to a state of calm once the threat has passed. So let's walk through how this works real quick. The emotional brain sends a threat that sounds an alarm, that sounds a message to your body to react. This happens automatic at an unconscious level and very, very quickly. For example, you hear a loud noise. You immediately jump before you even know whether you're in danger or what the noise is. It's important when faced with a potential threat that all people, children included, react first and think second. The thinking brain assesses this situation to see if the danger is real or if it's just a false alarm. If the thinking brain confirms that the threat is real, it temporarily goes offline and lets the emotional brain take over, and it starts that flight or fight response to keep us safe. When the stress response gets activated, physiological responses can include increased heart rate, blood pressure, rapid breathing, sweating, tunnel vision, and difficulty thinking clearly. When neither flight or fleeing is an option in the moment, sometimes kids might freeze or just shut down during a threatening situation or a situation they perceive as threatening. For younger children who often cannot fight or flee, shutting down might just be their best option for dealing with overwhelming stress. And I'm sure you see this play out in your schools. Once the threat has passed for the child, the thinking brain helps to shut off the alarm. The body then puts the brakes on and allows them to calm down and come back into balance. It's very important to keep in mind, though, that not every experience that sets off this stress response is traumatic. Sometimes it's just stress. The experience becomes traumatic when it overwhelms a child's system for responding to stress, when they are completely overwhelmed and feel helpless. When their attempts to fight or flee are not effective in preventing or managing the threat, they're left feeling helpless, vulnerable, and completely out of control. When this happens, the emotional brain continues to sound the alarm and send messages to fight or flee or freeze well long after that threat has passed. If this cycle continues or it occurs too often, kids might even start reading non-threatening situations as threatening, as dangerous, and their trauma may get triggered, and you start to see some of those behaviors occur in your classroom because they stay in survival mode all of the time. Every situation, every antecedent in their environment is telling them it's dangerous. And so they stay in that survival mode and they escalate those behaviors. So these traumatic events can have short-term and long-term effects on a kiddo's daily functioning. So we've talked about quite a few things. We're going to pause and see if there are any questions we want to address. And while you're thinking of any questions or comments, if there's anything you'd like to share, I'd just like to throw out to you, have you seen this stress response cycle play out in your classroom or school and maybe not have contributed it to trauma or understanding that cause and effect? So trauma can be experienced in real time, or the experience can just simply be triggered. In our past example with the loud noise, that triggered that stress response system. So there's a lot of triggers that can occur for a child in their daily life and at school. Any loud noises, such as a fire alarm, yelling in the crowded hallways, bells to indicate moving from class to class, loud music, sometimes even the announcements can be a trigger for kids. Some of those things can just remind kids of the trauma or traumatic event that they have experienced. They perceive the situation as dangerous and that response system goes into place. Sometimes it's not even a noise or a touch. It can be something like a particular space or place, maybe a playground, a parking lot, a crowded hallway, a bathroom. Maybe they've witnessed violence or had a bad experience, maybe some extreme bullying in those spaces and places. And that can re-traumatize or create trauma for them. Sometimes emergency vehicles or the personnel that come in them can trigger a child, such as a uniform, a siren. It can remind them of events that have been traumatic for them at home or in their community. For some people too, even certain smells, food, perfume, cleaners, can trigger some traumatic events that have happened. And even the weather and specific times of the year can take a child back to a traumatic experience and reenact that for them. So the unfortunate thing about these triggers is when kids walk into your classrooms, we don't know what their triggers are. They don't come in with a sign around their neck that says, "Hi, my triggers are loud noises, crowded hallways, and the smell of chicken strips." They just come in and we just have to see how they respond to things in our classroom. So the first things we need to do to be trauma sensitive is first be aware that trauma occurs for kids. Be aware of the signs to look for and what their triggers are. So we need to recognize the signs of trauma, and then we need to help kids identify them and then teach them coping strategies. While we might not be aware of every trigger for every child, we do hear and see the response in our classroom. And responses can vary by age and stage of development. For young children, common responses after a traumatic event can include fear, anxiety, and worry about continued danger. You might observe changes in sleeping and eating patterns, or the outcome from changes in sleeping and eating patterns with tired children. You might see extreme difficulty in separating from caregivers in the morning during drop-off. Sometimes young children will even start to regress in some of their behaviors. Maybe they're getting pretty good at their speech and they start to decrease that vocabulary, or they might start to wet their pants or not participate in activities. It's also common for children to attempt to process what happened to them by reenacting aspects of the traumatic event in their play. So when you're watching kids during free time or in centers or out on the playground, you might see them use harsh words, swearing, throwing objects, hitting, hiding, some of those kinds of things. As kids grow and develop, school-age children may focus on their own actions during the traumatic events. And they will start to have feelings of guilt or shame. Sometimes they even believe that the traumatic events were their fault. How that will play out in your space and place is kids might need to go see the nurse more often, frequent headaches and stomach aches, kids reporting they had nightmares, that they're tired, they have difficulty concentrating in school, they can have angry outbursts or withdraw. And oftentimes about this age, they might start to just over or underreact to situations or experiences at school, such as those movements, loud noises, or physical contact. So we can start to see when kids get triggered and how this comes out in their behavior. Again, as kids get older, they still experience a great deal of fear, anxiety, and concern about the traumatic event. They also start to think about how others will view them after the trauma. What do people think of them knowing they've been through something like that? And they might start to feel shame, guilt, responsibility, or even embarrassment about the situation. They might start to withdraw from their peers or activities they enjoyed in the past. They might start to suffer from intense mood swings, as if adolescents need more intense mood swings. They might start to perform poorly in school. They can engage in more risk-taking behaviors, drug and alcohol abuse, sexual behavior, self-harm, things like that. Not only are the students affected by the trauma, but the impact of trauma on schools can be profound. Oftentimes, negative behavior is more likely to occur if schools aren't trauma sensitive or escalate. And if the adults aren't aware or equipped, they might start to use more reactive, controlling, or punitive measures in an effort to try to control behavior. This often results in more time out of the classroom for students, and then attendance and test scores decrease because kids aren't in class to learn. They've been asked to leave due to different things. Suspensions and expulsions may rise, and this just leaves a negative impact on school safety and overall culture. So where do you start? What do you do to be trauma sensitive? First and foremost, it's being aware of trauma and considering a person's history or experience when providing services in order to do no harm and promote healing. So from the school perspective, you want to consider every child's history and experience when you're providing education and just ensuring that you're always acting with the intent of doing no harm. And secondly, it's changing that question from what is wrong with you to what happened to you and how can I help? Behavior is communication, and when kids engage in behavior that interferes with learning, we can't just think what's wrong with you or you need to get out of my classroom. We really need to take a step back and ask, wow, what has happened to get you here and how can I help you? So those two things of doing no harm and asking that question of what happened to you are your first steps in changing that lens and how you view children. Like we just mentioned, without the knowledge of trauma and its impact, there can be significant implications for schools. The reality has spurred this movement to create trauma-sensitive schools where all school staff recognize and understand student responses to trauma, and where practices support healing and resilience are embedded school-wide, not just in your classroom. Teachers, counselors, coaches, and administration are at greater risk of misunderstanding, misidentifying, or overlooking students' trauma-related behaviors and responding in ways that cause additional harm. In an environment of fear and crisis, adults might become increasingly rigid and reactive. For example, adults might be quick to threaten students with negative consequences, escalate right alongside the students, and use more punitive discipline strategies in an attempt to regain control. Staff who feel powerless to address trauma in their own lives or in the lives of students may unintentionally deny trauma or silence those who have experienced it by minimizing its effect. As a result, students' behavior may increase in frequency, intensity, duration, and schools risk re-traumatizing students by creating environments and situations that can mirror or even replicate the trauma that students have already experienced. When the entire school community is affected by trauma, safety, engagement, and a sense of community are compromised. What ends up happening is frustration, which can lead to the use of coercion, restraint, seclusion, and isolation. The point of a trauma-sensitive approach is to reduce the use of these 4 aggression techniques. A trauma-sensitive approach requires changes to your mission, vision, practices, policies, and culture of the entire school so that all staff are capable of supporting students exposed to trauma. So this effort really starts from the top down. Adopting a school-wide approach to addressing trauma ensures support for all students, enhances identification of students who have more intensive needs, and fosters a climate and culture that supports other initiatives designed to foster safe and supportive school environments. So it's important to go beyond using strategies that just address the symptoms and the behaviors that you're seeing. It's important to utilize strategies that promote an overall climate of understanding. Understanding that behavior is simply communication, and it's the adult's responsibility to manage the situation. Using that filter of what's happened to you and how can I help is a great first start. We want to have the environments that promote self-control, where adults stay in control of themselves, teach kids coping strategies so that they can stay in control of themselves and be able to articulate the things that they need to be successful at school. We want to focus on skill building and teaching kids the skills they need to get their needs met at school to cope with trauma both within school and outside of school, and then offer replacement behavior for them. Keeping an eye on the prize. Where do kids want to go? What's their future focus? How can we help get them there and teach them the skills academically and socially that they need? We always want to take a look at what children bring to the table and what they do well, and start to teach them skills from the strengths they already bring and help empower them to make good choices and advocate for themselves. If we can build on their strengths, they can experience small wins early on, and they're likely to keep trying. Trauma-sensitive schools implement policies, procedures, and strategies that promote a safer environment, teach students self-advocacy skills so they can advocate for themselves, that they can ask for help so they're less likely to be re-victimized. Correction and consequences should be just, and they should be delivered within a relational approach within the context of teaching. Also, replacement skills must be taught to empower students and to build relationships with kids. We want to make sure we're avoiding coercion, force, and control at all costs. We do have one question that just popped in. A child is saying they're hearing voices. Can trauma trigger a mental illness? Absolutely, especially complex trauma that has lasted over time, that extreme abuse or neglect. Really impacts the way the brain develops and the child's coping strategies. And so due to the environment and the ongoing trauma or stress and the impact it has on the brain, it can definitely contribute to mental illness. There are things you can do in the classroom or in the school to keep the child safe, but I would definitely recommend referring that child to the counselor or mental health professional for an official diagnosis. If you look at the brain scans of young children who've been exposed to extreme neglect, their gray matter is just a lot less than kids who are brought up in a nurturing environment. And so very important that we get the kids the support they need, teach them the skills to advocate for themselves, and get them the therapeutic services that they need? Excellent question. By now, you might be starting to self-reflect on how you perceive or react to student behavior. Do you take it personally? Do you feel like it's something kids are doing to you? Or do you see it as about they're using the best coping strategy they know how? Think about how you can change your lens from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Can developing trust help a child with trauma? Absolutely. Kids who've experienced trauma often feel very, very helpless. They don't know who to trust, and they don't feel safe on the most basic level. So building a relationship with kids and establishing that trust, letting them know that they have one caring adult to go to, can make all the difference. It promotes that resiliency for kids, connecting them with other kids that they can relate to and do things with, as well as with you, can very much help support. That can give them an avenue to maybe start to share some things or articulate what has happened or what they need so that they feel safe and that they can feel better. So trust with a caring adult will definitely help counteract that trauma. Excellent question. So let's look really quick about how does the Boys Town education model align with trauma-sensitive practices. The good news is we very much align with trauma-sensitive practices. There are many hallmarks to our model, but I really just want to focus on two major ones that cross everything we do within the education model, and that is teaching skills and building relationships. Teaching skills provides a framework to communicate expectations and offers a predictable platform for students to gain proficiency and confidence. And building relationships is key for students to gain trust, like we just talked about with that question, as well as reassurance and that overall sense of safety. How we put these two together is through our social skills curriculum. Our teaching interactions, our strategies to prevent problem behavior through our proactive teaching and blended teaching, how we encourage positive behavior through general, specific, and effective praise, how we correct kids along a continuum, and how we use strategies to de-escalate behavior are all reliable processes for both the student and the adults to teach, practice, and reinforce the behaviors that will help kids be successful at school. This ultimately helps students get their needs met because they can exhibit appropriate behaviors and learn to generalize and internalize these skills for better self-management. And that's our ultimate goal with teaching skills and building relationships, is to empower kids to make good decisions. I could talk about hallmarks all day long, but I think it's important that we look at our hallmarks through the eyes of a child. For some kids, for example, this little girl on the screen, for her, school, if we look at it through her eyes, school can sometimes be a scary place, and I don't always know what to do. My teacher knows it's scary for me, but he has a nice voice, and he shows me skills ahead of time, and he teaches them to me so I know when to use them. Practicing these skills feels silly sometimes, but then it's easier to do them when I really need to. If I mess up, the adults just show me what to do instead and let me practice. And when I do it right, they tell me that, and that makes me feel good, so I want to keep trying. They don't yell or threaten me or make me feel bad about myself. I also know because they taught me how to calm down when I feel upset. I know no matter what kind of day I'm having, I always know that my school is a place I feel safe, and I will get through the things that are hard and enjoy the things that are fun. I can also use my skills when I'm in a new or scary place, or even with people I don't know. So some of you might be familiar with parts of our education model. So our proactive teaching, really front-loading kids and giving them the skills they need, teaching them at a neutral time, allowing them the opportunity to practice so they experience success, catching them being good and reinforcing their efforts along the way, even when they just come close. When they start to get off track, catching their behavior when it's small, and providing them with replacement behavior within the context of teaching, and letting kids practice and explore that is very helpful. And when kids do experience trauma, when they are triggered, when their coping strategies just aren't working out for them, the de-escalation strategies used within the model treat kids with dignity and respect, help kids calm down, find that balance that we talked about. The danger's over. We can find that balance and talk through the issue. Trauma-sensitive practices, just like our model, teach students self-control and how to feel safe and confident in navigating their world. Schools that embody these core principles of trauma-sensitive practices have staff who understand trauma and are committed to building positive, healthy relationships with students. They are willing to teach the whole child while offering choice and empowering students. They are culturally competent and collaborate on providing all students with varying levels of support. As you go through trauma training and you learn more about trauma, it's very important that all staff are on the same page, that they've had training in trauma, they recognize that it's real, and they can start to recognize those signs in their students. And then taking a look at that whole school approach, really taking a look at the policies, procedures, mission, and vision, and what's going on in the building, and are they embracing trauma-sensitive strategies as well. Keep in mind that trauma-sensitive school environments are good for all kids. So just like with incorporating our model with the teaching strategies of being proactive, encouraging, correcting when behavior is small, all those things help to build relationships with kids because kids know that you care because you're taking the time to teach them what to do. So know that trauma-sensitive environments benefit all children. Those whose trauma history is known, those whose trauma will never be clearly identified, those who might be impacted by their traumatized classmates, so that together we can ensure that all children will be able to achieve their highest levels despite whatever traumatic circumstances they have endured. So as you move forward and start thinking about trauma-sensitive practices or fine-tuning the ones that you currently have, some questions you might want to consider are, first of all, are we looking at it from what's wrong with you to what has happened to you? Are you looking at to what extent your school is talking about trauma and its effects regularly? Is everybody on the same page? What steps has your school taken to adopt a trauma-sensitive approach? And what more would you like to do? And actually, if you have the answers to any of those questions, you can just go ahead and type those in the chat box. As you continue on your journey, if you're implementing the Boys Town education model or other models that are helping you to address behavior, and you're starting to learn more about trauma and revamp those policies, we will also be sending a follow-up email with a downloadable checklist that will help you to recognize signs of trauma and assess trauma sensitivity in yourself, your classroom, and your school, because this is a definite ongoing process. Also, as you continue in this work, you can get additional resources through the Boys Town Press and off of our website at boystowntraining.org. There are various resources in the press catalog for educators, mental health workers, parents on various topics that will help you, such as the Worry Workbook for Teens. There's books on grief and other mental health issues. The boystowntraining.org website has lesson plans around social skills that will help empower kids who have suffered trauma to find their voice and be able to advocate for themselves. There are also various blogs and articles of interest on the boystowntraining.org website that lend themselves to topics on trauma. Okay, we have a question on how to differentiate well-managed schools training to incorporate more trauma. And I'm not sure I'm understanding your question completely, but so if you can type in some clarity or I'll give it my best shot. Well-managed schools is a school-wide approach that focuses on a social skills curriculum that we can teach to all students. So some of those skills are things like following instructions, disagreeing appropriately, asking for help, advocating for oneself, those types of things. And so as teachers start to incorporate skill teaching into their classrooms and across curriculum and throughout the child's academic day, some of those skills will nicely lend themselves to just getting their needs met at school, and some of those will also lend themselves to addressing some of the traumatic experiences that kids are having. So whether it's starting to identify feelings, express feelings, how to ask for help, those kinds of things can help kids find a voice and encourage that overall safety. And then the teaching interactions that we went through in the webinar are the ways that you communicate those skills. So we proactively teach those skills and have kids practice those at neutral times. We reinforce kids as they use the skills or attempt to use them. And when kids get off track, using corrective teaching to identify what behavior maybe isn't appropriate for school, how they can fix it, and replacing the replacement behavior is helpful. And then when kids do struggle, the strategies to de-escalate. And so what happens with the teaching interactions is we're communicating social skills to kids that will help them to get their needs met, regardless of why the behavior is occurring. Also, all of the teaching interactions incorporate common language, so that can be used throughout the school. And that creates some consistency and predictability for kids, which is really important for kids who've experienced trauma. When I've experienced trauma and everything feels like a dangerous situation, and at every time I turn around, I don't know what's going to happen, that increases my anxiety, and kids stay in that alert state all the time. So they're always in that flight, fight, or freeze. So the predictability and the consistency help kids to know what's going to happen, whether they like it or not, but they know what's going to happen, and that gives them a sense of stability and safety. And that's really imperative for kids who suffered trauma, because oftentimes the environments outside of school are not predictable, they're not consistent, nor are they stable. So with use of the model, it can really help kids who've experienced or are continuing to experience that trauma. The stability and predictability is more often found in DAEP environments, which is why some students get into trouble in order to go there. Unfortunately, school staff think negatively of those placements rather than learning from them. That's true. A lot of times kids go to, because of their behavior, they get put in alternative environments, and they tend to like those spaces and places better. There's fewer kids. They're probably experiencing fewer of the triggers. And it's just a safer place. And even though we do some skill teaching and send them back to a less restrictive environment, sometimes that environment doesn't understand the hard work that they have done. And so communicating, here's our program, here's what we're teaching, here's the progress the student has made, those can be very, very helpful to just let them know that how the child has worked very hard, that you've worked on some specific skills, and that they're just making progress. They're using the skills more often, more consistently, and making improvements. So I see a question from one of our trainers. What I'm asking is, can we have a few of these slides incorporated into the Well-Managed Schools training so folks who are also receiving trauma-informed can better see how they fit? Yes, Eric, we can do that. So for those of you who are authorized trainers and listening, yes, we can definitely share some of those with you. Oh, there's a question on resources for adults' traumatic backgrounds when they're triggered. I can't think of any resources off the top of my head. As I answer the question, one might come to me. That's a really, really good point, and I'm glad you asked that question. As we're working with kids who have suffered trauma and they're communicating that through their behavior, it's important to recognize that we as adults may have also experienced some trauma and be aware of what our triggers are and what our traumas were and how we can address that. So it's knowing those things about myself that sometimes cause my thinking brain to go offline. And so if the kid's operating on an emotional brain and I'm operating on an emotional brain, that we're going to have a conflict going on here. And so just as an adult, being aware of, here's some things that I have encountered or that I've experienced that might impact my ability to work with kids. So identifying your own triggers and your own coping strategies, having those conversations with colleagues and not being afraid to have that conversation of saying, when this happens, I sometimes don't make the best decisions with kids and I might need some backup. So just being cognizant, communicating that, and learning your own coping strategies, such as those belly breaths, that walking away for a few minutes, that counting to 10 in your head. And again, I think that frame of what has happened to you and how can I help you is a nice filter of just taking that deep breath and remembering to ask that question. Nice comment. Our district has implemented a social emotional department at the district, and they are working directly with these areas. A lot of this sounds like soft skills training as well. Absolutely. those skills, following instructions, being on time, being organized, getting along with others, having a conversation, all of those skills not only help kids be successful at school, they just help people interact better with one another. And they actually help people just be able to advocate for themselves and to be clear on what they want and what they need to be successful. And we can't always cater to everything everyone needs or wants, but we can at least give them a voice, which is one thing that people who have experienced trauma have not had. We can give them that voice, and we can give them the skills to accept the response, and that's more than that they have had. When they have just gone into that fight or flee or shut down, they haven't been able to use that voice. So it takes them away from those feelings of helplessness and hopelessness and empowers them to do the things they need to do. I've seen several questions on what books would you recommend. I'll tell you what, on our Twitter chat tomorrow, we'll give you a list of books from our press catalog. I can think of a few off the top of my head, but I can give you a more comprehensive list tomorrow. And just seeing the themes of, we've had many staff that have also gone through traumatic events, and that's true. We are just people. And so having those staff meetings over what are some of the traumatic events that you've had, what triggers you at work that causes you to go back to that space and place, just offering some coping strategies, just even having the conversation that we're all human and we all have baggage, and it's okay to know and to talk about those things. When you know what your colleagues' strengths are and what their weaknesses are, and maybe where they might struggle a little bit, that's going to be very helpful just to have that conversation so that you know you have each other's backs. And if you need to tag team students or tag team responsibilities, that can be done. So getting on the same page, and again, that's looking at it from the top down. What policies and procedures do we have in place school-wide? What conversations have we had as a staff and as a grade level to acknowledge our own past trauma? And then what triggers do we see in, or what behaviors do we see from kids? Can we start to pinpoint the triggers for them? Can we alter those in any way? And then what skills can we teach the kids, and what procedures can we put in place? Can they take a self-selected timeout? Can they just have a moment to calm down? And those types of things before we have to send them out of the learning environment. Very good. I think we're about out of time for today, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We will get that some books recommendations out to you for both adults and for kids. We thank you for your participation. Everybody have a good day. Thank you.